Hello, Internet. This is Daniel with Driving Dragons, and today I'm going to take a look at a video from Tenkar's Tavern, your bartender in the OSR. Saw this posted to the Dungeon Craft Facebook group and wanted to take a look at it. Looks like it has to do with his take on why Wizards of the Coast just keeps recycling their classic settings over and over again. And it seemed like something that might be a little interesting, and let's see what I agree with and what I disagree with.
Folks, hello and welcome to Tavern Chat. I am your host, Eric Tenkar, your bartender in the OSR, your main proprietor at the Tenkar's Tavern blog. And we've got an article up on the screen, and it's talking about Dungeons and Dragons will revisit classic campaign settings. And I know that sounds exciting, right? It may, but really, how exciting is it? Dungeons and Dragons' Jeremy Crawford explains why there haven't been more campaign setting-specific books. Now, let's be honest with you. These campaign settings are pretty much all created back in the 2E days. These are settings that are 30 years old? What are we talking about here? Well, Dungeons & Dragons does not view the recent revivals of Spelljammer, Planescape, and other campaign settings as one-shots and plans to revisit at least some of these worlds in the future. At Gen Con earlier this month, comicbook.com had the chance to speak with D&D lead rules designer Jeremy Crawford in a wide-ranging interview about the future of Dungeons & Dragons in the midst of planning for the 2024 rules revisions. By the way, this is actually important. Jeremy was at Gen Con. WOTC is giving a shit now about conventions. Why is that? Because they are realizing they got to do some face-to-face meet. They got to exist in your mindset. They're going to go, they were at Gen Con, they're going to be a game hole. Oh my, look at that. What a change.
I'm not sure if I agree with that. Wizards of the Coast does not need to be out in front of people, to be perfectly honest. Dungeons and Dragons is ubiquitous. It is like Kleenex. Nobody says facial tissue when they need something to blow their nose with. They ask for a Kleenex. And Dungeons and Dragons has that kind of impact. Even some of these campaign settings, some of these older campaign settings like this, have that kind of influence. The reason I think that you actually have them showing, WOTC showing back up to places like Gen Con and Dragon Con and stuff like that is because they've got a massive PR problem where they are kind of seen as the big evil corporation that is faceless and nameless and doesn't care and isn't in any way out there or part of the hobby, and they want to kind of look like they are in touch with the groups, with the hobby. And I think the big part of it too is that that's something that was specifically trashed by a bunch of members of the hobby here, when a bunch of people in the hobby, when they, going through WOTC's really brutal first quarter and fourth quarter of 2022, where they were just scandal after major PR mess up after major PR mess up. And one of the big complaints was like these guys don't care about the game. They're not even at these cons. So they're kind of trying to put the lie to that. Now, something he mentioned a little earlier, he's talking about, these are all old 2E settings. It's like, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm struggling to think of an official campaign setting that came out since WOTC took over the Dungeons and Dragons trademark. And the only one I can think of is Eberron, which was in like 2004, 2005. That is the only one I can think of that was created for WOTC. Everything else, I'm almost 100% certain that everything else is recycled and tacked on. So let's see what else comes up.
During the interview, comicbook.com asked about D&D's plans for its campaign settings, especially as Witches of the Coast revisited. That's the way they show it, revisited in quotation marks. Many classic settings such as Planescape, Spelljammer, and Ravenloft in recent years. Again, this is all 2E stuff. Well, although Ravenloft has its roots in 1E, but again, what new settings has WOTC brought to us? Well, they're going to tell us now. Our campaign setting books are very popular, Crawford said. People love the setting books that we've done, whether they're classic ones or new ones from Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering. It's not a new setting. This is a setting from Magic the Gathering, a card game that was, late 1990s? So, yes, you're converting the setting to D&D 5e. You're not giving these people a new setting.
I'd have to go back and look and see which MTG settings they have pulled up. I mean, if they got Dominaria and, Phyrexia and stuff like that, no, those are not new. That's Brothers War, Urza Cycle stuff from the 90s, back when I actually used to play Magic. But, if they're bringing over a lot of the newer Magic the Gathering settings, those are newer settings, and I really don't blame them for doing that. It's actually a wise double use, because there is a pretty decent crossover between Magic the Gathering players and Dungeons and Dragons players, and at least there was back when I was still playing Magic the Gathering. But the settings, I'm not so sure that the Magic the Gathering settings are generally conducive to Dungeons and Dragons the way that WOTC has the rules written. But that said, they're just because they're dual purposing it with Magic the Gathering, if they're using the newer settings, they're using the newer settings. But he may be right on this, because I don't know which settings they have pulled from MTG into 5e, because I don't play 5e.
You are not giving, we've had Forgotten Realms since, what was it, the end of 1e, beginning of 2e? Why have we not gotten a new setting, except for the Magic the Gathering, which is an IP that they've owned? Why are we recycling settings? I'll get some ideas on that. Crawford also stated he didn't look at the recent campaign books as one-shots, and that there were plans to return to many of the campaign settings in the future. By the way, notice, no Greyhawk, right? We love the campaign setting books, but they're not really campaign setting books, because you can't run a campaign in these books. You're getting just enough flavor to put stuff into your campaign world, but it really isn't enough to make it its own campaign. We love the campaign setting books because they help highlight just how wonderfully rich D&D is. D&D can be gothic horror. It can be fantasy in space. It can be trippy adventures in the afterlife in terms of Planescape. D&D can be classic high fantasy in the forms of Forgotten Realms. It can be sort of steampunk fantasy like an Eberron. We feel it's vital to visit these settings, to tell stories in them, and we look forward to returning to them. So we do not view these as one-shots. Again, why haven't we seen a new... Eberron was the last new setting for D&D, and Eberron was a result of a contest. Okay? Yes, Baker did well. He won the contest. But it wasn't even designed in-house. Why aren't they designing a new setting in-house? There's got to be something unique, or there's got to be a setting out there that's in the OSR or an independent setting that they figure they could invest in and make it the next setting. They don't want to do that because everything is Forgotten Realms.
I'm going to wait and reserve the bulk of what I'm thinking until I actually hear his reasons for why he thinks they're recycling everything. But you're already starting to see kind of, why are we not getting all these new settings? Why are they not developing these new settings in-house? Well, the same reason that Wizards of the Coast created the OGL in the first place. And like I said, I'm going to reserve that for a second to see if he actually tells it. But this is way more, it's way more efficient. And then of course, just recycling things is more efficient in its own way.
These new settings are just to add a little extra flavor to your Forgotten Realms game. All right, you're not going to see Greyhawk because Gary is verboten.
I am going to cut in again there. Tell me about it in the comment section below. I don't play 5e. I don't buy 5e books, so I haven't read the 5e campaign settings. But you tell me, do these new campaign setting books, quote unquote, actually have sufficient information to run a game in their game world, or is it like he's saying that it's really just window dressing for the existing Forgotten Realms campaign setting that they've already got, just a kind of a palette swap, so to speak, in terms of like classes and everything that's available there? Because I look back, and I mean, even in the early days of WOTC D&D in the 2000s, I remember like the Forgotten Realms campaign setting and the Oriental Adventures campaign setting and whatnot that they redid. And they actually did have sufficient information in there for you to run a completely unique campaign within the Forgotten Realms or within Oriental Adventures. And then obviously Eberron came out in 3rd edition. So I'm not sure how much 5th edition has changed. So tell me in the comment section below, is there actually enough material in these campaign setting books from 5th edition to basically pick it up and play and have a truly unique world? Or is it really just a, hey, let's palette swap Forgotten Realms in terms of classes, races, etc.?
It's a shame. In fact, Crawford noted the upcoming 2024 rules revision provides more opportunities to revisit these worlds, in part because the D&D design team doesn't have to keep going back to remake certain rule systems or rule books moving forward. Remember, your old books are compatible because they're not changing the core system, but they are changing the core classes. When you change the core classes, you're changing game balance. But they always talk about game balance, but they don't really mean it. This is another boon of the rules division. It means we can keep journeying in the multiverse. Rather than sort of having to reset the clock, the rules divisions means that we can return and do different things the next time we visit a setting. Look at it through a different angle, explore different parts of the setting, dig deeper in certain areas than we did before. If you imagine 5th edition as a D&D campaign, it means the campaign can keep going. So we're going to get to high level and see things that we haven't seen before. By the way, my opinion as to why they regurgitate old settings, I'm not complaining. I like these old settings. I own the originals from the 2E days. And they're not apparently Birthright's not even in the list here, is it? But I firmly believe the reason why they regurgitate the old settings is not just a lack of creativity on their part, although that's a huge aspect to it. It's that if something comes up, as we saw in Spelljammer, that is suddenly offensive, that somehow makes it past the, the culturally aware editors, and this is offensive now, although it wasn't offensive then, they can blame it on old WOTC or old TSR.
Okay. I think he's reaching here. Well, that could be, I could see that being something of a consideration of the idea of kind of a plausible deniability. Oh, there is this quote unquote problematic or whatever the hell thing in the background, and we can blame it on the people who wrote it back in the 80s rather than risking something new that might offend somebody. But it's a bit of a stretch for several reasons. One, WOTC is populated with leftist, social leftist people. Like that's the kind of people they're going to hire. That kind of company, you're not going to have. You would have to have a closeted conservative, and I don't even think a closeted conservative could really get on and stick around with WOTC the way WOTC's run. Second is there's a thing called sensitivity readers. Every major publisher employs them. I guarantee you that WOTC already employs them for the Dungeons and Dragons books, even when you start looking at the recycled stuff. They have sensitivity readers. These are people who are essentially paid to read the book and get offended so that they can go change the things that offend the professionally offended people. They're already going to have those on staff. As far as the creative bankruptcy, yes and no. I'm going to let him go forward here, but I'm going to have some more response on that. Like I said, I believe it's kind of like the reboot fetish in Hollywood. You know, the Hollyweird major motion picture climate right now is reboot, 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 don't do anything new. It's either reboot or adapt, reboot, adaptation, reboot, adaptation. And it's kind of the same reason why we keep seeing recycled campaign settings, in my opinion. But I'm going to let him go ahead and see if he touches on that later on.
The funny thing is, they tried doing that with the Planescape stuff, and it wound up the revision that made the stuff offensive was done under WOTC and under the WOTC Watchful Eyes. So, again, it shows you that there's a lack of creativity at Wizards of the Coast. Creating a new setting would be spot on awesome. There's so much you could do, so much you could spark, but they're afraid to do it because if they create something new, they have to own it. And the moment you have to own something, you're at risk. And that's why, in my opinion, we don't see new settings from anybody at WOTC. But maybe you think I'm wrong. Maybe you think I'm full of shite. Let me know. Also, complete side note, I am trying to get Temple of Elemental Evil to work on my Mac using crossover.
Okay, so since he's moving on to another thing real quick, I'm going to go ahead and kind of put my comments here. I do think he's off base. I think he is a little bit conspiratorial on this one. And I see a lot of this with the OSR. It's really easy to jump on and attack the politics of WOTC. Because here's the thing. Just as a general rule of thumb, the older you get, the more conservative you tend to be, especially socially. And what Wizards of the Coast has kind of done, and this has kind of been the birth of the OSR and more aggressively the Bro-SR, is they have basically told a large portion of these players who have been Dungeons and Dragons DMs and players, especially DMs, sometimes since the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. They have basically come out in 5th edition and taken an ESG approach, which ESG is it's an investment set of investment principles where you look at your environmental, social, and governance score with a company in order to have large companies like BlackRock and whatnot be willing to include your stock in their portfolios and whatnot. And that leads to a lot of these like decisions that seem like they're bad business because they are bad business, but the hedge funds won't buy them without a certain ESG score. So they focus on things like their diversity and inclusion scores and their social justice nonsense and the stupid stuff. But what you got is because they do that stuff and because they basically demonize the people who disagree with it, and they can't come out and make the change without telling the people who have done this for years with no problem, that they're bad. You can't come out and say, oh, well, Spelljammer has all this bad slave racism in it, and without turning around and saying, oh, basically saying, if you like Spelljammer the way it originally was, you're a bad person. So they have progressively alienated that older group, and that older group, which is reflected in the OSR, has essentially become more sensitive to that. They like to look at everything through the lens of, oh, this is more WOTC West Coast politics coming in, ruining the hobby. But that's not the case here. This is a business decision for two real reasons. And like I said before, it goes back to the original reason that the OGL was originally invented. What Wizards of the Coast very rightly determined when they launched 3rd edition is they looked down and they said, TSR was damned if they did, damned if they didn't. They were caught between a classic catch-22 rock and a hard place. The rock is, if they're not constantly putting out more material, they're not selling more books. They were a traditional publisher. They're not getting more revenue. And when it comes to investors and bringing in more capital, it's what have you done for me lately, not what have you done for me. So you had to have new stuff out there, and you had to stay top of mind with your player base. So you couldn't just release your core books and then focus on your big stuff. You had to have constant content coming out, which means you had to create a bunch of content. And that puts us between the hard place, the rock. So that's our hard place. Here's our rock. Our rock is that by producing all this stuff, you're going to have duds. And by producing them quickly, you have a higher chance of a dud. And you have a higher chance of a dud derailing a bigger project. So to do these big campaign settings and stuff right, you need time and investment and effort to put into them to make them worthwhile. Meanwhile, you're putting out the infamous splat books on a regular basis that are costing you money to put out and are often not even covering their cost because you're putting them out so frequently to stay top of mind that they're not selling well enough to really even cover their own cost. And it looks like you're constantly putting out garbage. Wizards of the Coast recognized this. They couldn't not put out the content, fall out of favor, not have any of the recurring stuff. They had to create the repeat business or they had to have that. But at the same time, they also didn't need to flood the market so much, and they had to separate themselves from they had to stay top of mind, but they needed to not flood the market at the same time. So what they did was they said, hey, we're going to do the OGL. So all of you independent creators and independent publishers, you can freely access our IP and freely reference our rules just by printing the sheet and putting it in the back of your book. And it'll be quasi-official, which will help you sell it as an independent publisher. But it also alleviates the risk of your Wizards of the Coast from these short notice, these quick turn and burn splat books that you can't really control the quality on them because they have to come out so quickly. Meanwhile, Wizards of the Coast would focus on adapting a Forgotten Realms, adapting the Oriental Adventures, adapting other Spelljammer, or really focusing on Monster Manual 2. And really, when you start looking at Monster Manual 2, Dungeon Master's Guide 2, Monster Manual 3, Monster Manual 4, a lot of these are literally like a best of or biggest hits from the OGL splat books that came out that they didn't even produce a lot of times. A lot of times that's what it was, but they could focus on curating that content and making the bigger things. So that long-winded explanation of the OGL, which we've all heard ad nauseum, is going to roll around to why you don't have the new campaign settings, why you have so much recycled content. It's because to create a whole new campaign setting to develop it from the ground up, it doesn't just require creativity. I mean, you especially when you have a group of people, and you say what you want to about writing by committee, but when you got a lot of people together who are all kind of like this is their job and they're doing it, they can come up with campaign settings and different unique ideas and storyboard them and make them happen. But you're talking about large amounts of investment in completely creating something new, something that has no name recognition, then having to spend money and time and effort marketing that new system, that new setting, pushing that out there, and turning around and hoping that it catches on, hoping that it's something cool. Because, you know, customers are fickle. And you may put out this brand new cool campaign setting that's got all this cool, unique stuff, and they turn around and they're just like, hey, wait a second, you know, why couldn't we just do Forgotten Realms? Why couldn't we just explore the lower part of Toril that's not the Sword Coast or something? Why did we have to go back to this? Why didn't we do Dark Sun? Because we haven't done Dark Sun. You know, why don't we revisit Dark Sun? Why did we waste this? Or you have a hit. You have something that really catches on, but it's a big risk and it's a large investment and a lot of work that goes into it. Conversely, you can just take something that has name recognition, that needs very little marketing, that is going to create its own hype and buzz because, I don't think Dark Sun will ever come back because Dark Sun's got too many things that, like Tenkar is saying, they're going to want to stay as far away from as possible. It's just too problematic for their current player base. But let's just say they were going to bring back Dark Sun and they announce it. They can very minimally market that, and the buzz around Dark Sun is coming back is going to tear through the TTRPG community like wire, or mainly the D&D community like wildfire. It's going to generate its own excitement. You're going to have all the YouTube channels talking about what they think is going to happen, how they're going to change this, how they're going to change that, how excited they are. They're going to be rehashing the old version, all that stuff. Marketing budget, 25% of what it would have been with a new campaign setting. Also, you can cut out a large portion of the storyboarding, of the brainstorming ideas, of all the other things. You just take what's already there and you add a little bit, you add a couple of twists, you correct a few things as far as missteps from the old setting, and you roll it right back out. And most of the work goes into converting it to the new system as it is. So you have something that you know is going to be at least moderately successful because you're going to have the fans of that setting that are already baked into the cake. It's a lot lower risk. Just like when you look at Hollyweird right now, they're going to remake the remake of the remake 9 times before they trust something new, because they can look at things like the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and how it just basically prints money. But it's basically rehashing the same old franchises over and over and over again. It's nostalgia baiting, and it's name recognition. It's cheaper and easier to reference. There's already some stuff that the audience expects built into it, and they can rehash and reboot it over and over again and have fewer royalties, fewer people to deal with. Even the shooting and stuff should be a little bit easier because your actors are going to come in having some working knowledge of the ideas and concepts that are in the movies because they've been done 1,000 times. And what it comes down to at the end of the day is a company like Wizards of the Coast would rather have a string of mediocre releases with the occasional decent success than have the success, big success, failure, mediocre, failure, big success. They'd rather have the consistent flat plane of reliable steady Eddie, because steady Eddie is what investors like. It makes them a safe bet. It gets Wizards of the Coast making Hasbro happy, and it makes Hasbro something that wants to be shoehorned over into hedge funds and things, or not hedge funds, but like mutual funds and things like that. It gets bought into by as part of this stability section of investments on a regular basis. And you might think, well, Dungeons and Dragons is a minuscule portion of Hasbro. It's not even something that Hasbro would sneeze at. But you try to move, basically a CEO there is going to say, look how consistently successful we are. We may not be a great success, but we're consistently successful. See what else he's got to say. Okay, so following that, he just kind of went into his new background, like, share, subscribe, all that fun jazz. Talked a little bit about Baldur's Gate 3 and Temple of Elemental Evil and a few other things. Not really anything that I really find of note there. Tenkar's Tavern. It's a great channel. Definitely something to subscribe to. I don't really agree with him on this one. I think he's showing some of that OSR sensitivity. I'm not saying that there's no truth to what he says, and that definitely is going to play into things like them never re-releasing Dark Sun ever again. But I think the business reasons far override anything having to do with politics or plausible deniability. Because even if they stepped in it and they ticked off that base, they would just do the apology tour and the complete capitulation and the release of this, that, and the other, and the new changes and other stuff. And they'd be right back to where they're at. The thing about it is, with the professionally offended people get offended, get pissed, and then turn around and forget about it the second you hand them a treat or a distraction. So they're not concerned about re-winning that group. They'll just come out and talk about how they now have a new class, that to be this class you have to be disabled or something, to do representation or social diversity or whatever. So anyway, guys, like, share, and subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I will see you guys next time.